Today's reading comes from the first book of Psalms, Psalm 13. How long, O Lord, will you forgive me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord, my God. Light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Lest my enemies say, I have prevailed over him. Lest my foes rejoice, because I am shaken. But I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord, because he has dealt bountifully with me. This is God's word for us today.
Thanks, Stuart. Good morning, friends. My name is John. I'm one of the elders here at Wingfoot, and every week I have the opportunity to lead us through this word, this book that Stuart just read from. This book, the Bible, is all about Jesus. And so as people who are centered on the hope that we find in Jesus, we look to this book to understand who he is and to understand what he is doing every week. And every week we need to be reminded and to find answers about what God is doing and who God is through this word. So that's why we take the time every week to open it, to read it, to consider it, and then to live it out. A few weeks ago, we started a series called Mixtape. And Mixtape, we're exploring this book called the Psalms that Stuart just read from. The Psalms are a collection of music. It's a collection of music written by several generations of people as they are trying to figure out what in the world is God doing? What is God doing? How do we follow him? How should we make sense of what he's doing? So if you've ever wondered that, God, what are you doing? What do you want me to do? What decision do you want me to make? The Psalms are asking that same question. And so we are opening up this album, if you will. We're putting the headphones in, if you will, and we are listening to people as they seek to understand who God is and what God is doing. Now, the past 2 weeks, we looked at the first two songs, the first two Psalms, Psalm 1 and Psalm 2. I used this picture that these two are the original tracks on the album. They were written specifically to introduce you to what you're about to listen to. And the first psalm introduces us to the question that the Psalms want us to ask, and that's this: who's on repeat? Who are you listening to over and over and over again? Because the person or the voice that you listen to will shape your heart. It will shape your head. It will shape how you live. And so it's really important to pay attention. And Psalm 1 invited us to listen to God's song and to God's story over and over and over again. It said, if you do, you will be like a tree planted firmly in the ground. You'll have a foundation. Psalm 2 we looked at last week, and it introduced us to the central character of the Psalms. That there is a character that looms large over this book, and so he's going to show up, and so we should be watching for him. That's the Messiah, Jesus. And Psalm 2 invited us to ask this question: who's wearing the crown? Who is in charge? Who's calling the shots? Because God has appointed Jesus, and Jesus is king, and so we should be looking for him throughout the Psalms. And so this is the kind of the tone that the Psalms want us to listen for. Now, the next couple weeks, we're going to hit shuffle, and we're going to start to explore this album. We're going to be looking at different types of songs in this album, different messages and different questions that people are asking throughout the Psalms. And so we're going to explore different songs to meet us where we are and to invite us to process life in light of who God is and what God is doing. Now, throughout the Psalms, there are two specific types of songs. Just like when you listen to music or maybe the radio, there are specific types of music or radio you listen to, right? You can listen to oldies, which I think is now like creeping into the 70s and 80s, which might be challenging for you. You can listen to like classic rock. You can listen to hip hop and R&B. There's different types of music, and those types of music have different rules to them or different expectations to them. The same thing is true in the Psalms. In the Psalms, there are different types of music, and so we have to pay attention to what type of music we're listening to. The psalm that we're going to look at today that Stuart just read from is what's called a song of lament. A song of lament. That's one of two main types of songs in the book of Psalms. The other type is songs of praise. Now, songs of praise we're probably more familiar with. They are songs of celebration. They are songs celebrating that God is moving, that God is acting. We're thanking him. We're celebrating him. Those are the songs that we like to sing. But lament are the songs that we avoid. The songs that we don't like to sing. One pastor and author, Sun Chang Ra, he described lament this way. He said, lament is the sound or the language of suffering. Lament is the language of of suffering. It's that deep groan that comes out of you when life is falling apart. That deep angst that you feel, or that sob that comes out of you when you have lost something profound. That is what lament is. Now, here's the interesting thing. If you were to read through the whole book of Psalms, all 150 songs, you would find that 40% of the Psalms are songs of lament, are songs of suffering. What that tells us is this, is that life is going to be hard. That the Psalms anticipate that things are going to be difficult. And that throughout the Psalms, what we find is that following God is not always just kind of dancing through a field of daisies, that oftentimes faith, following God, figuring out what God is doing, is going to be a struggle. It's going to be hard. And so the Psalms of lament invite us to sit in that space, to enter into that space, and to ask the hard questions of life. But the Psalms invite us into that space. And so we're going to do that this morning by looking at Psalm chapter 13. But in that same book, Soon-Chang Rah, he's talking about lament, and he says this: we avoid lament. We don't like these songs. We don't like to listen to these. We don't like to hear these. And so we're going to talk about first why we avoid lament. We're going to talk about why we avoid lament. Second, we're going to talk about why we need lament. Why do we need these songs? And third, we're going to talk about how to approach lament. How to approach lament. So first, let's talk about how or why we avoid lament. In that book, Soon-Chang Rah, he looked at all the songs that are sung in churches. He found a list of like the top 100 songs that are sung in church, and he said only 2 of them could even vaguely categorize as lament. That only 2 of the 100 songs that are most often sung in church could be categorized as songs that sound like Psalm 13, saying, "How long, God?" And so he explores why that is, why we avoid these spaces, why we avoid hard things. I think there's really 3 reasons why we avoid these types of songs, why we avoid the language of suffering. The first reason is this: our culture. Our culture. We live in a fast-paced, quick-fix culture. Right? We're always moving. There's always something more to do. There's always another thing to tackle, another side job to pick up. There's always more to do, and we live in a very quick-fix culture where it's like, here, read this book and it will fix your problems. Here, take this pill and it will fix your problems. Here, do all these things and it will fix your problem. Read a self-help book and you'll be fine. We live in a culture that moves too fast to lament, too fast to sit in suffering. We don't have time for it. And so we're constantly on the move. We don't want to stop and ponder and listen. And if you've ever sat with someone in grief, or you've sat in grief yourself, you know that there's not really a defined process to this. I found myself sitting with a counselor a couple of years ago processing grief, and I had heard that there are 5 stages of grief. And it was the first time I was sitting with him, and he said, "Okay, what stage am I in? And how can I get to the next stage?" And he said, "That's not how it works. I wanted a quick fix." And instead, he said, "You need to sit in this. You need to enter into this." And so our culture says we need to be quick fix, fast-paced. But the other problem with that is this, is that our culture has never, in a lot of sense, really experienced what David is experiencing here. That our culture has sort of always been on top. As long as our country has existed, we've sort of been in this on-top space. We've kind of never experienced true military defeat. Now, we've had failures and we've had embarrassing things happen, but we've never experienced what David's experiencing here, where he is about to be on the bottom. He's about to have someone overcome him. And so if you're always in a dominant culture, you're not going to have time or space to listen to lament. In fact, if you belong to a dominant culture that's always been on top, lament might even sound like heresy. Might even sound like someone asking a question that threatens this thing that I've trusted in all along. If we always believe that we're exceptional, we always believe that we're on top, lament is going to sound very uncomfortable. And yet the Psalms say we should ask those questions. That we should listen to those who aren't at the top, but in fact those who are at the bottom. And so our culture often stands in the way of us listening to this. But the other reality of that is this: our Christian culture stands in the way of this. And we come to church and we want to have great praise songs, and we do. Like we should, the Psalms have those. But oftentimes churches are focused on growth and progress. Even as a church plant, right? We're focused on growth, and it's like, hey, more people are coming, that's great. But yet Lament says, sometimes if you're failing, that's where you should be. And so our culture that's focused all on growth and forward motion is not going to be able to listen to lament. But the second reason why we avoid lament is our conditions. That the conditions of our life don't demand this kind of response. Right? Notice David is in a spot where he says, God, if you don't show up, I'm screwed. That is where he is living. God has to show up or else everything is going to fail. But how often do we live in those spaces? How often are we in a spot where if God doesn't actually show up, I could fail and fail hard? And so we manage our life. We manage our schedule. We manage our budget. We manage our relationship. We manage our kids. We manage everything. And so everything is under control. And so the conditions of our life are such that we don't need God to show up at all because we have managed it to the nth degree. And yet David finds himself where he says, God, if you don't show up, I'm going to fail and I'm going to fail hard. So the conditions of our life prevent us or keep us from listening to lament. But the third reason is we value our comfort. We value our comfort. We would rather sit in a comfy space and protect ourselves and avoid grief and suffering. I mean, think about the last time you stood in line for like calling hours or maybe a repass, and you knew that you were going to be talking to the family that had lost someone, maybe even tragically. And as you're getting closer, you're starting to think about, what am I going to say? What am I going to say? How am I going to, there's nothing that I can say that can fix this. There's nothing that I can say that would make this feel better. And sometimes we fall into these kind of quick, easy things where we say, well, God must have needed them more than you. Or God must have loved them more than you. And we sort of go to these answers that are really more about our comfort than theirs because we value our comfort. And so we avoid lament. We avoid suffering. But the problem is when we avoid lament, one of two things happen. We do one of two things. The first thing that we do is we lie. We lie. We lie about the condition of our own life. We lie about the things that are going on in our own hearts, the feelings and the emotions and the angst and the suffering that's going on behind the surface. And so we lie and we put on a nice face and say, no, everything's good. Or we might even say, well, this week was really hard, but I believe that God's going to do something. And we go to these comfortable answers and we're really lying about where we are, putting on a face and putting on a mask. But the second thing that we do is we silence. And we silence the voices of those who are really suffering. Where if we're not willing to listen to the lament, and someone is saying, hey, I'm struggling over here, or hey, I'm suffering over here, or hey, the system isn't working for me, or I'm experiencing injustice, yet we're over here and we're saying, what are you talking about? Things are good. We're not listening to them, and we plug our ears to them, and so we silence the voice of suffering. Because we value our comfort, and so we've kind of gated ourselves in over here. And people who are suffering over there, we say, well, if you would just do what I did, then maybe you would be okay. And so we silence the voice of people who are truly lamenting in our culture, truly suffering. And so we either lie or we silence. But the reality is that we need lament. We need lament. That's what the Psalms show us, is that over and over and over again, that lament is often what faith sounds like. The faith doesn't have to just sound like, I believe that God can do it. Sometimes lament sounds like, how long, O Lord? And so let's talk about why we need lament. Lament decenters us and recenters God. Lament decenters us and recenters God. It reminds us that we're not the center, that we don't have everything figured out, that there are things going on in the world that are bigger than us, and we need to be reminded that because we often put ourselves in the center. And say, I've managed myself. I've managed my schedule. I've made progress because I worked hard, or I got the promotion, and so I did this all in my own strength. You see, lament decenters us in a couple ways. It decenters our perspective. It decenters our perspective. Notice David, he says, light up my eyes. He's asking for a new, fresh perspective. He's been seeing things a particular way, and lament is causing him to realize he hasn't seen everything. And you see, what often happens is when we're in that place of a dominant culture, or in that place of comfort, or we've managed our conditions, we assume that our perspective is the right perspective. And so we look at people who are suffering, we look at people who are struggling, we look at people who are grieving, and we say, if you could just do what I did, then you'd get here. That's centering your perspective, centering my approach, and say, if you would just be like me, then you wouldn't have to lament. And yet lament says that suffering is real, and that the system doesn't work for everybody. In fact, that God is working not through those who have it all together, but often through those who don't. And so lament tells us we should listen to people who are suffering. We should listen to the voice of those who are struggling. We should listen to the voice of those who are at the bottom, because God's voice might be speaking through them just as much as through us. And so lament decenters our perspective. But the other thing that lament does is lament decenters our strength. That when we're managing our world and managing our stuff, we start to feel like, hey, I did this. I worked hard. I got the promotion. Or I worked hard and I built this house, or I bought this house with my own sweat and blood. I did this, and yet lament decenters that and says, my strength is not enough. Notice that David's ultimate fear that he fears here, he says, light up my eyes lest I sleep the sleep of death. That ultimately what he is anticipating, what he is fearing, what he is asking God to intervene is that he is on the verge of death. That no amount of strength can keep you from that. No amount of strength can keep you from that moment. The strongest person that we have still faces the threat of death. And so at some point or another, suffering and lament invite us to consider that our strength is not enough. No matter how well you can manage your schedule or manage your life, that suffering and loss will find you. And so it decenters us. But the beautiful thing about lament is that it recenters Jesus. It recenters Jesus, that as we start to experience that my perspective is not the central perspective, that my strength is not enough, what we find is that God has been listening to our lament all along. He has been hearing you in the midst of your struggle, hearing you in the midst of your suffering, and Jesus is his answer. Because the beautiful thing about Jesus is that he is most clearly revealed, not in his strength, but in his suffering. That as he hangs on a cross, stretches his arms out to die, the victim of an unjust trial, put on that tree by a mob, he is hung on that tree, and the last thing that he says is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which would sound like blasphemy. That would sound like heresy. He's saying, God, you've forgotten me. God, you've forsaken me. But yet Jesus in that moment is giving himself for us. And he is quoting from Psalm 22. Which is a psalm of laments. In fact, one of the most intense psalms of lament that talks about how his body is being broken, how he is being dried up. And so Jesus, as he's hanging on that cross, paying the price for our sin, he is lamenting. Which means this, that if you feel God forsaken, if you feel like God has rejected you, that God isn't showing up for you, that God isn't answering your prayers, that is where Jesus was. And so we have in Jesus one who has lamented for us, one who has suffered in a deeper and more profound way than we have suffered. And because he does that, and he actually enters into the sleep of death that David fears, we have in Jesus one that we can trust, one who knows the depths of suffering, the depths of sorrow, and who said, God, you've forsaken me, and yet I still trust you. And so when we know Jesus, this one who laments for us, we know the one who entered into that suffering and yet secured a way for us to no longer have to fear the ultimate sleep of death. Now, he entered into the sleep of death for us. And so when we trust him, we have in him one who has lamented for us, one who knows what it is to be God forsaken. And so sometimes the language of faith, sometimes what it sounds like to have faith is not always, I've got everything figured out, but oftentimes it's, God, where are you? God, what are you doing? I don't know who you are. I don't know what you're doing. Sometimes that's what faith sounds like, just as much as it is, I trust you, God. And in fact, saying how long, God, is itself a statement of trust. And you see, through lament, what we find is this. We are reminded that we serve a God who transforms suffering into strength. He transforms our suffering into strength, that your suffering is not wasted, that the heartbreak that you're experiencing is not wasted, that God uses our suffering and uses the heartbreak and uses the grief and the lament to build strength in us, because he used Jesus' suffering to secure for us a future. And so whatever the suffering is that you carry, whatever that lament is that you carry, you can voice it to God. Because if Jesus can say, God, why have you forsaken me? Then your prayer can be embraced by God as well. And that's what God does through the laments. He says, this is a prayer I want my people to pray. So let's talk about how we approach lament then. If we avoid it because of our culture and the conditions and the comfort of our lives, but we need it because it shows us Jesus, how do we approach lament? I just have three things that you'll see David do. It's actually almost a formula that David walks through. In the first two verses of the psalm, David first names it. He names the suffering and the heartbreak that he's going through. The lament often starts with this question, how long? How long am I going to have to continue to bear with this? And notice how encompassing David's lament is. First, he names the spiritual suffering. He says, God, it feels like you've forgotten me. God, you have hidden your face from me. So he's experiencing spiritual suffering. But notice he's also experiencing emotional suffering. He says, how long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart? Right? How long do I have to have this emotion just rolling through my head? How long do I have to be awake at night just trying to figure out what's going on? So he experiences emotional lament. But he also experiences physical suffering. He says, if you don't come through, I'm going to experience death. I'm going to lose my life. He also experiences social and political suffering. A lot of people think this is happening as David's son is rising up against him to take the throne. And so there's family suffering and social suffering. He's losing friends. He has political enemies rising up against him. And so David names it. He says, how long must this continue, God? So to approach lament is first to name it. And to name it clearly. To not just kind of skirt around the issue, but to say, God, this is my suffering. This is what I'm dealing with. This is what is overwhelming. How much longer must I carry this? How much longer must I deal with this chronic pain? How much longer must we deal with gun violence on our streets? How much longer must we go until my family is reconciled? How much longer, God? That is where lament begins, by naming it. But the second thing that David does is he prays through it. He prays through it. Notice what happens in the next two verses. He says, consider and answer me, O Lord my God. That's actually way too polite of a translation. He is demanding an answer from God. He's saying, God, show up. Light up my eyes. I need you in this moment. And so he is bold and demanding God to listen to him. He says, God, I need you. So lament is not just screaming into the darkness, hoping that someone hears you. Lament is screaming to the God that you know loves you and who does hear you. And so you can say, God, I need this right now. Would you show up to me right now? Light up my eyes. Help me see what you're doing, or else I'm screwed. That's what lament does. It says, God, this is what I'm going through. I know who you are. And so you pray through it. But the third thing that David does is he waits in it. He waits in it. If you get to the last two verses, we don't really have any sense that God did something. He says, here's what I'm going through, God. I need your help. I need you to show up. And then he waits in it. And the only thing that we know changed is David's perspective. The only thing that we know changed is his heart. And he is reminded of God's loyal love, his steadfast love. And so David waits in it. And oftentimes this is what happens in lament, is that as we name it, as we pray through it, we also have to wait in it. But as we pray through it, and as we pray through this with others, we are reminded that God's love is loyal. That God loved us to the point of being God forsaken himself in Jesus. And so that whatever the suffering is that you're experiencing right now, there may not be an answer right now. And that might be a space in which God is asking you to continue to pray through it, to continue to name it, to continue to come to him and to seek for him even in the darkness, because you know his love is loyal. And that as you do this and pray through this, you're reminded that God's love will never let you down because he has loved you in Jesus. And you might wait in it your whole life. And I think sometimes we want the quick fix and the easy answer to my prayer, but sometimes there's not going to be relief here. In some Psalms, the Psalms end in just heartbreak and questions. But the beautiful thing about this is that Jesus promised that his kingdom is coming. Actively coming, not one day in the future, that his kingdom is on the move and it is coming. And when his kingdom comes fully, it will be a kingdom of justice and righteousness and healing and hope and perfection in this world where all things will be brought together. And when you read Revelation, the last picture, one of the last pictures that you have is that God has brought his kingdom here to earth. And then it says this, and he will wipe away every tear from your eye. I was thinking about that this week because I often thought, like, we're going to get to heaven and it's going to be like, man, this is amazing. Man, we're going to be singing shouts of praise. But when we get to heaven, we have tears in our eyes. We actually are still carrying the grief. We're still carrying the lament. And yet God is promising that that last tear, that last heartbreak, that last pain, that last question, he's going to answer. He's going to wipe it away. And so he is our trust. That whatever that last tear is that we take to him, he's going to be holding the Kleenex and says, I got this. You have no more tears that you need to cry. This is the God that we wait on. The God who has loved us in Jesus. The God who invites us to demand things from him, to name the things that are going on. And the God who has promised that one day he will make all things right. And so you can go to him and say, God, where are you? I need you in this moment. And his love will be loyal to you. So this morning, we're going to sit in this a little bit. Because lament is not just about our heads. It's about our hearts. But the things that we're carrying. The things that are overwhelming us. The things that are stressing us out. The things that feel unbearable. And so the way we're going to do this, we're going to do this in a number of ways. We're going to actually read Psalm 13 together as an act of saying we are in this space together. I'm going to lead us through this, and anytime it says how long, this will be on the screen, anytime it says how long, we're going to say that together. Because together we are asking that question of how long must we continue to be in this space. And then as we conclude that, we're going to enter into a space where the band is going to lead us through a song. It's actually based on a song of lament from Psalm 42. And in this space, I want to invite you to do one of two things. In the seats in front of you, there's a note card and a pen, or it should be close to you. I want to invite you, if you feel like you have this how long question in you, to write it out. To just finish that question, how long, O Lord, and write it. Maybe it's something personal in your life. Maybe it's something in your family. Maybe you're looking out at our city and our world and saying, how long must this continue to go on? Actually write out that lament as an act of faith and trust that God hears you. Maybe you don't have one for yourself, but maybe you have some for someone else. And take this time to do that as well. And also just sit in the words of this song. As this song walks us through Psalm 42, this song of lament. And then in a few moments, we're going to have the opportunity to respond in faith and trust that our God is a God who is good. And so if you would join me in this, you can stay seated. I'm going to lead us through this, but as you see the words in bold on the screen, we're going to read through this together. Let's say this together. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Lest my enemies say, I have prevailed over him. Lest my foes rejoice because I am shaken. And let's say this all together. But I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. Let's enter into a space of seeking God in the midst of our suffering.